December 31st, 1945. Tokyo lay in ruins. Smoke still rising from neighborhoods reduced to ash and rubble. The air smelled of charred wood and something worse, the lingering scent of death that no amount of wind could carry away. In a makeshift office inside a former schoolhouse converted into a U.S. Army administrative center, a young American soldier named James Mitchell sat across from a Japanese woman who wouldn't meet his eyes. Her name was Fumiko Tanaka. She was 19 years old, translating documents for the occupation forces to earn enough rice to keep her mother alive. Jim was 22, from a town in Kentucky so small it didn't appear on most maps. He had been trained to see her as the enemy, but when she finally looked up, her eyes weren't filled with hatred. They were filled with exhaustion, grief, and something he recognized because he carried it too, the weight of surviving a war that had stolen everything familiar. James Mitchell had been born in 1923 in a town called Harlan, Kentucky, deep in coal country. His father, William Mitchell, had been a coal miner who enlisted in the Army during World War I and never came home. He died in the Meuse-Argonne offensive in France in 1918, 5 years before Jim was born. Jim's mother, Margaret, was pregnant when she received the telegram. She was 21 years old, alone, and terrified, but Margaret Mitchell was made of steel. She took a job at the local textile mill, working 12-hour shifts 6 days a week. She raised Jim in a 2-room house with a leaking roof and a wood stove that barely kept them warm in winter. Jim grew up knowing his father only through a faded photograph on the mantel, a young man in an army uniform with serious eyes and a slight smile. Margaret told him stories about William, about how he loved to sing, how he could fix anything with his hands, how he believed in doing what was right even when it was hard. "Your father was a good man," she would say. "He didn't want to go to war, but he went because his country needed him, and he gave everything." Jim idolized the father he never knew. He also carried the weight of being the only thing his mother had left. When Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7, 1941, Jim was 18 years old, working at the same textile mill as his mother. The next morning, men lined up outside the recruitment office. Jim wanted to go with them, but Margaret begged him not to. "I already gave your father," she said, her voice breaking. "Don't make me give you too." But Jim couldn't stay. Everywhere he looked, people were enlisting. His friends, his neighbors, men he'd known his whole life. The radio played patriotic songs and speeches about duty and honor. Posters showed Uncle Sam pointing, declaring, "I want you." Jim felt the pull of it, the sense that history was calling and he couldn't turn away. In March 1943, he enlisted in the United States Army. Margaret didn't speak to him for 3 days. On the morning he left for basic training, she stood on the porch and watched him walk down the dirt road with his duffel bag. He turned back once and saw her standing there, small and alone, and nearly changed his mind. But he kept walking. Basic training was at Fort Benning, Georgia. Jim had never been outside Kentucky. The world suddenly felt enormous and terrifying. He was surrounded by men from places he'd only read about. New York, California, Texas, Michigan. They came from different backgrounds, spoke with different accents, believed different things, but the Army made them all the same. They woke at dawn, marched until their feet bled, learned to shoot, to fight, to follow orders without question. Jim was good at it. He was strong from years of physical labor, and he had a natural discipline that the drill sergeants appreciated. He made friends quickly. His best friend was a guy from Boston named Thomas Callahan. Tom to everyone who knew him. Tom was loud, funny, and reckless. He balanced out Jim's quiet seriousness. After basic training, Jim was assigned to the infantry and shipped to the Pacific Theater. He arrived in the Philippines in 1944. Nothing could have prepared him for what he found there. The heat was suffocating, the jungle thick and hostile. They fought the Japanese in brutal close-quarters combat. Jim saw men die in ways that would haunt him forever. He killed enemy soldiers, young men not much different from himself, and felt something inside him harden and go cold. War wasn't glorious. It wasn't heroic. It was blood and screaming and the smell of rotting bodies in the heat. The Battle of Okinawa in 1945 was the worst. It lasted 82 days. Jim's unit was tasked with taking a ridge held by entrenched Japanese forces. They fought for every inch of ground. Jim watched his friends die. He held a kid from Ohio named Danny as he bled out from shrapnel wounds, whispering for his mother. Tom Callahan took a bullet through the shoulder but survived. Jim pulled him to cover while machine gun fire tore up the ground around them. "I owe you one," Tom gasped, pale and shaking. "Don't worry about it," Jim said. but his hands were shaking too. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, Jim felt nothing. Not relief, not joy, just a vast, empty exhaustion. The war was over, but he didn't feel like he'd won anything. He felt like he'd lost pieces of himself that he'd never get back. His unit was assigned to occupation duty in Tokyo. They arrived in September, and Jim stepped off the transport into a city that looked like the surface of the moon. Entire neighborhoods were gone. Survivors moved through the streets like walking skeletons, their eyes hollow. Children begged for food. Old women picked through rubble looking for anything salvageable. Jim had seen destruction before, but this was different. This was the aftermath, the long, slow reckoning of what war truly cost. The army set up administrative centers throughout the city to manage the occupation. Jim was assigned to a former schoolhouse in a district that had been partially spared from the firebombing. His job was clerical work, processing forms, managing supply requisitions, coordinating with local officials. It was boring, but after months of combat, boring felt like a gift. The office was staffed by a mix of American soldiers and Japanese civilians who had been hired as translators and clerks. Most of the Americans treated the Japanese staff with suspicion or outright hostility. These were the people who had bombed Pearl Harbor, who had tortured POWs, who had fought with fanatical determination. The propaganda had painted them as subhuman, and many soldiers still believed it. Jim didn't know what he believed. He was tired of hating. He was tired of everything. Fumiko Tanaka started working in the office in late September. Jim noticed her immediately, not because she was beautiful, though she was, in a quiet, understated way, but because of how she carried herself. She moved through the office with her head down, shoulders slightly hunched, as if trying to take up as little space as possible. She spoke only when spoken to, her English clear and precise. Some of the soldiers made crude jokes about her when she wasn't around. A few propositioned her directly, assuming she'd be grateful for the attention. Fumiko ignored them all with a dignity that Jim found remarkable. The first time Jim spoke to her directly, it was purely professional. He needed a document translated from Japanese to English, a requisition form from a local supplier. He approached her desk and said, "Excuse me, miss, could you help me with this?" Fumiko looked up, startled. Most soldiers didn't say, "Excuse me," or "miss." They barked orders. She took the document, scanned it quickly, and translated it in a quiet, steady voice. When she finished, Jim said, "Thank you. I appreciate it." She blinked, as if she wasn't sure she'd heard him correctly. "You're welcome," she said softly. Over the following weeks, they worked together frequently. Jim made a point of being polite, of treating her like a person rather than a tool or an object. It was such a small thing, but in that environment, it stood out. Fumiko began to relax slightly around him. She still didn't smile, but the tension in her shoulders eased when he approached her desk. Jim started to notice things. He noticed that Fumiko never ate lunch. The other Japanese staff members brought small portions of rice or vegetables, but Fumiko never touched food during the day. He noticed that her clothes, though clean and carefully mended, were worn thin. He noticed the way her hands trembled slightly when she wrote, and the dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and chronic hunger. One afternoon in late October, Jim was eating lunch at his desk. A sandwich from the mess hall, an apple, and a chocolate bar from a care package his mother had sent. He glanced over at Fumiko, who was bent over a stack of papers, her face pale with concentration. Without thinking too hard about it, he stood up, walked over to her desk, and set the chocolate bar down in front of her. Then he walked away without saying a word. Fumiko stared at the chocolate bar for a long time. Chocolate was a luxury she hadn't tasted in years. She looked up, searching for Jim, but he was across the room, deliberately not looking at her. Slowly, carefully, she picked up the chocolate bar and slipped it into her bag. That evening, she broke it into small pieces and shared it with her mother. It was the first sweet thing either of them had tasted since before the war. The next day, Fumiko approached Jim's desk during a quiet moment. "Thank you," she said, "for yesterday." Jim looked up and shrugged. "It's just chocolate." "No," Fumiko said quietly. "It's not." After that, something shifted between them. They began to talk, cautiously at first, just small exchanges during work. Jim asked her how long she'd been in Tokyo. She told him she'd lived there her whole life. He asked if she had family. She hesitated, then said, "My mother. She's all I have left." Jim understood loss. "I'm sorry," he said. "Thank you," Fumiko said. Then, after a pause, "Do you have family?" "My mother," Jim said, "back in Kentucky." She raised me alone after my father died in the First War. Fumiko looked at him with something like recognition. We've both lost much, she said. Yeah, Jim said. We have. Over the following weeks, their conversations deepened. They talked during lunch breaks, during slow afternoons when the office was nearly empty. Jim told her about Harlan, about the coal mines and the mountains, about his mother's strength and stubbornness. Fumiko told him about her father, who had been a schoolteacher with a love of literature and history. She told him about her younger brother, Kenji, who had been 12 years old when he died. He loved baseball, Fumiko said, her voice distant. He wanted to play professionally someday. He used to draw pictures of baseball stadiums, these elaborate designs with stands and scoreboards. He kept them in a notebook. She paused. The notebook burned with everything else. Jim didn't know what to say. What could he say? I'm sorry, felt inadequate, so he just sat with her in the silence, and somehow that felt right. Fumiko told him about the night of March 9th, 1945, the night the firebombs fell. She had been staying with an aunt in the countryside, helping with the harvest. Her mother had been visiting a sick friend in another district. Her father and Kenji had been home. The B-29s came after midnight, wave after wave, dropping incendiary bombs that turned entire neighborhoods into infernos. The fires created windstorms that sucked oxygen from the air. People suffocated before they burned. Over 100,000 people died that night. Fumiko returned to Tokyo 2 days later. The city was still smoldering. She walked through streets she'd known her entire life and couldn't recognize anything. Everything was ash. She found the place where her house had been. Nothing remained except the stone foundation and twisted metal. She searched for days, hoping to find her father and brother, hoping they'd somehow escaped. She never found them. They were gone, erased as completely as if they'd never existed. I don't know why I survived, Fumiko said quietly. I was supposed to be home that night. If I hadn't gone to help my aunt, I would have died with them. Sometimes I think I should have. Don't say that, Jim said, his voice rough. Fumiko looked at him. Why not? What purpose is there in surviving if everyone you love is gone? Jim didn't have an answer. He'd asked himself the same question after Okinawa, after watching Danny die, after pulling Tom's bleeding body to safety. Why him? Why not someone else? What made his life worth more than theirs? I don't know, Jim said finally, but I'm glad you're here. Fumiko's eyes filled with tears. She blinked them away quickly, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. Thank you, she whispered. As November turned to December, Jim realized he was falling in love with Fumiko Tanaka. It was the worst possible thing that could happen. She was Japanese. He was American. 4 months ago, they'd been enemies. His country had dropped atomic bombs on hers. Her country had attacked Pearl Harbor. The hatred between their nations was deep and fresh and raw. And yet, when he was with Fumiko, none of that seemed to matter. She understood him in a way no one else did. She'd seen the same darkness, carried the same grief. When they talked, he felt less alone. He knew it was impossible. He knew that if he pursued this, he'd be risking everything. His career, his relationship with his mother, his place in the world. But he also knew that if he walked away, he'd regret it for the rest of his life. Tom Callahan noticed. Tom noticed everything. One evening, after most of the office had cleared out, Tom cornered Jim outside. You're in love with her, Tom said. It wasn't a question. Jim considered denying it. Then he sighed. Yeah. Tom whistled low. Man, you really know how to pick 'em. I know it's crazy, Jim said. It's not crazy, Tom said. It's just complicated. You know what people are going to say, right? You know what your mother's going to say. I know, Jim said quietly. Tom studied him for a moment. Then he clapped him on the shoulder. Well, if you're going to do it, you better be all in. Don't half-ass it. If you love her, really love her, then fight for her. Because it's going to be a fight. I know, Jim said again. December 31st, 1945. The office closed early for New Year's Eve. Most of the soldiers headed to the bars or back to the barracks to drink and celebrate. Jim stayed late, finishing paperwork. When he finally left, he found Fumiko standing outside the building looking up at the winter sky. It was cold, and she wasn't wearing a coat. Jim shrugged off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders without asking. She startled, then looked at him. You'll be cold, she said. I'm fine, Jim said. He stood beside her close enough that their shoulders almost touched. What are you thinking about? Fumiko was quiet for a long moment. The city around them was silent, the ruins stretching out in every direction. I'm thinking that I survived, she said finally. I don't know why, but I did, and I think maybe that means I'm supposed to do something with the time I have left. I'm supposed to live, not just survive. Jim's heart was pounding. He turned to face her. Fumiko, he said, and his voice was shaking. I know this is crazy. I know it's impossible. I know everything is against us. But I need to tell you, I love you. I don't care about the war or what people think or what the rules say. I love you, and I want to build a life with you, if you'll have me. Fumiko looked at him, and for the first time since he'd known her, tears spilled down her cheeks. You don't know what you're asking, she whispered. Your family will hate me. Your country will hate me. I will be the enemy in your home for the rest of my life. Then we'll make a new home, Jim said. Together, just us. Fumiko closed her eyes. When she opened them, they were filled with fear and hope in equal measure. Are you sure? I've never been more sure of anything, Jim said. She reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were cold and small in his. Yes, she said. Yes, I'll marry you. Jim pulled her into his arms and held her as fireworks began to explode over the city. Celebration of the new year. Celebration of peace. Celebration of a future that suddenly felt possible. But getting permission to marry was a bureaucratic nightmare. The U.S. military actively discouraged relationships between American servicemen and Japanese women. There were policies in place, forms that had to be filled out, background checks that had to be completed. The process could take months, even years. Many soldiers gave up. Some married in secret and faced court-martial. Jim was determined to do it the right way, no matter how long it took. The first step was informing his commanding officer, a lieutenant colonel named Harrison. Harrison was a career military man, rigid and by the book. When Jim requested a meeting and explained that he wanted permission to marry a Japanese woman, Harrison's expression turned cold. Private Mitchell, Harrison said, I'm going to give you some advice. Forget about this girl. These Japanese women, they're looking for a meal ticket. They'll tell you anything you want to hear to get to America. You marry her, and in 6 months she'll take everything you have and disappear. With all due respect, sir, Jim said, keeping his voice steady. That's not true. Fumiko isn't like that. They're all like that, Harrison said flatly. You think you're the first lovesick soldier to come in here with this story? I've seen it a dozen times. My advice is to enjoy your time here, but don't do anything stupid like marrying one of them. I'm going to marry her, sir, Jim said. With or without permission. Harrison's eyes narrowed. If you marry without permission, you'll face disciplinary action, possibly dishonorable discharge. Then I'm requesting permission, sir. Harrison stared at him for a long moment. Then he sighed. Fine, fill out the forms, but don't say I didn't warn you. The forms were extensive. Jim had to provide detailed information about Fumiko, her full name, her family background, her employment history. Fumiko had to undergo a background check to ensure she wasn't a security risk. She had to be interviewed by military officials, who asked her invasive questions about her loyalties, her beliefs, her intentions. It was humiliating, but Fumiko endured it with quiet dignity. The process took months. During that time, Jim and Fumiko continued to see each other, though they had to be careful. Relationships between soldiers and Japanese women were frowned upon, and there were rumors that some officers were looking for reasons to deny marriage applications. They met in quiet places, parks, temples, small cafes on the outskirts of the city. They talked for hours, learning everything about each other. Fumiko taught Jim basic Japanese phrases. Jim told her about America, about the things they'd do together when they got there. Will your mother accept me? Fumiko asked one evening. They were sitting on a bench in a park, watching the sun set over the ruins. Jim hesitated. He'd been avoiding this question. I don't know, he said honestly. My mother she's strong-willed. She lost my father in the last war, and she's protective of me. But she's also fair. Once she meets you, once she sees how incredible you are, I think she'll come around. Fumiko didn't look convinced. I hope you're right. In April 1946, Jim received word that their marriage application had been approved. He ran to find Fumiko, who was working in the office. He pulled her aside, ignoring the stares from other soldiers, and told her the news. Fumiko's face lit up with a smile so bright it took his breath away. We're getting married, Jim said, laughing. We're actually getting married. Fumiko threw her arms around him, and for a moment nothing else mattered. The wedding was set for June 15, 1946. It would be small, held in a chapel on the military base. Tom Callahan agreed to be Jim's best man. Fumiko had no one to stand with her. Her mother was too frail to make the journey, and she had no close friends in Tokyo. A Japanese woman named Hana, who worked in the office, agreed to serve as her witness. Jim wrote to his mother telling her about Fumiko and the wedding. He tried to explain how much Fumiko meant to him, how she'd changed his life. He told his mother that he hoped in time she could accept Fumiko as part of the family. He mailed the letter in May and waited anxiously for a response. The response came 2 weeks before the wedding. Jim opened the envelope with shaking hands. Inside was a single sheet of paper with one sentence written in his mother's careful handwriting. "You are no longer my son." Jim read the sentence 5 times, hoping he'd misunderstood. He hadn't. He folded the letter carefully, put it back in the envelope, and sat on his bunk staring at nothing. Tom found him there an hour later. "What happened?" Tom asked. Jim handed him the letter. Tom read it and swore. "Jim, I'm sorry. She disowned me," Jim said, his voice hollow. "My own mother disowned me. She'll come around," Tom said. "Give her time." "Will she?" Jim asked. "Or did I just lose the only family I have?" He didn't tell Fumiko about the letter. He didn't want to burden her with his mother's rejection. But Fumiko knew. She saw the change in him, the way his smile didn't quite reach his eyes anymore. The night before the wedding, she asked him directly, "Your mother wrote back, didn't she?" Jim hesitated, then nodded. "And she's not happy?" Fumiko said. "No." Fumiko was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "We don't have to do this if it means losing your mother." "No," Jim said firmly. "I'm not losing you. Not for anyone." The wedding took place on a warm, sunny afternoon. The chapel was small and simple, with wooden pews and a plain altar. Jim wore his dress uniform. Fumiko wore a white dress that Hana had helped her sew from scraps of fabric. She looked beautiful. Tom stood beside Jim, grinning. Hana stood beside Fumiko, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. The chaplain, a kind man named Father O'Brien, performed the ceremony. "Do you, James Mitchell, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do," Jim said, his voice steady. "Do you, Fumiko Tanaka, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do," Fumiko said, her voice clear and strong. "Then by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." Jim kissed Fumiko and the small gathering applauded. It wasn't the wedding either of them had dreamed of as children, but it was theirs, and it was real. After the ceremony, Tom took them to a small restaurant off base to celebrate. They ate noodles and drank sake, and for a few hours they forgot about everything except each other. Tom raised his glass in a toast. "To Jim and Fumiko," he said, "may you have a long, happy life together. And may anyone who tries to stand in your way get what's coming to them." They clinked glasses and drank, and Jim felt, for the first time in years, genuinely happy. But happiness was fleeting. Jim's service was set to end in August 1947. As the date approached, he and Fumiko had to make a decision: stay in Japan or return to the United States. Staying felt like running away, like admitting defeat. Jim wanted to prove that their love could survive anywhere, even in a country that didn't want them. Fumiko was terrified of leaving Japan, but she was more terrified of losing Jim. In June 1947, Fumiko's mother passed away. She died quietly in her sleep, her body finally giving out after years of hardship. Fumiko was devastated. Her mother had been the last link to her old life, to the family she'd lost. Now she truly had nothing left in Japan except Jim. They buried Fumiko's mother in a small cemetery on the outskirts of Tokyo. Fumiko stood at the grave and wept, and Jim held her, wishing he could take away her pain. After the funeral, Fumiko turned to him and said, "Let's go to America. There's nothing left for me here." In August 1947, Jim and Fumiko boarded a military transport ship bound for San Francisco. The voyage took 2 weeks. Fumiko was seasick for most of it. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the hostility from other passengers. Some people stared at her with open hatred. Others whispered behind her back. A few women refused to use the same bathroom as her. One night, a drunk sailor cornered her near the restrooms and called her a slant-eyed whore. Said she was probably a spy. Said she had no business being on an American ship. Jim heard the commotion and came running. He grabbed the sailor by the collar and slammed him against the wall. "Say that again," Jim said, his voice deadly quiet. The sailor, suddenly sober, tried to pull away. Jim hit him, breaking his nose. Blood sprayed across the wall. Other sailors pulled Jim off before he could do more damage. Jim was confined to quarters for the rest of the voyage. but he didn't regret it. Fumiko visited him every day, bringing him food and sitting with him in silence. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Yes, I did," Jim said. They arrived in San Francisco in September 1947. The city was beautiful. Gleaming skyscrapers, bustling streets, the Golden Gate Bridge rising majestically over the bay. But Fumiko felt the hostility immediately. People stared at her. A woman spat at her feet outside a grocery store. A clerk refused to serve her at a diner, saying, "We don't serve Japs here." Jim wanted to fight every single person who looked at his wife with hatred, but Fumiko stopped him. "Fighting won't change their minds," she said quietly. "We just have to live our lives and prove them wrong." They moved to a small town in Pennsylvania called Millvale, far from Kentucky, far from Jim's mother. Jim found work at a steel mill. The pay was decent, $40 a week, but the work was grueling. He worked 10-hour shifts in the heat and noise, coming home exhausted and covered in soot. Fumiko stayed home at first, isolated and lonely. The neighbors ignored her. She tried to introduce herself, to be friendly, but most people wouldn't even look at her. One woman, Mrs. Kowalski, an elderly Polish immigrant, was different. She lived next door and had watched Fumiko struggling to carry groceries up the stairs. One evening, she knocked on their door with a casserole. "I thought you might be hungry," she said in heavily accented English. Fumiko was so surprised she almost cried. "Thank you," she said. "Would you like to come in?" Mrs. Kowalski came in and sat at their small kitchen table. She told Fumiko about coming to America from Poland in 1920, about the prejudice she'd faced, about how hard it had been to build a life in a strange land. "People fear what they don't understand," Mrs. Kowalski said. "Give them time. Some will come around, some won't. You just keep being yourself, and eventually, they'll see you're just like them." Fumiko clung to those words in the months that followed. It was hard, harder than she'd imagined. She missed Japan, not the ruined, starving Japan she'd left behind, but the Japan of her childhood, the Japan where she'd had a family and a place in the world. Here, she was nobody. She was the enemy. She was a curiosity, a scandal, a woman who didn't belong. But she had Jim, and that made it bearable. In 1958, Fumiko gave birth to their first child, a daughter. The pregnancy had been difficult. Fumiko was 32, older than most first-time mothers, and she'd suffered from severe morning sickness and fatigue. But when the baby was born, a healthy girl with a shock of dark hair and her father's blue eyes, all the pain was forgotten. They named her Lorraine after Jim's grandmother. Jim held her in the hospital room and wept. Fumiko, exhausted and pale, smiled at him. "She's ours," she whispered. "No one can take that away." Lorraine's early years were relatively peaceful. She was a bright, curious child who loved books and asked endless questions. Fumiko doted on her, teaching her songs and stories from Japan. Jim worked long hours, but always made time to play with his daughter when he came home. They were happy, in their small, hard-won way. But as Lorraine grew older and started school, the questions began. Other children asked why her mother looked different, why she talked funny, why she made strange food. Lorraine didn't understand at first. She just knew that sometimes kids were mean to her because of her mom, and it made her angry. In 1962, Fumiko gave birth to their second child, a son they named Robert, though everyone called him Bobby. Bobby was born into a country on the edge of transformation. The civil rights movement was gaining momentum. The wounds of World War II were still fresh, but the world was changing, slowly and painfully. Still, prejudice was alive and well, especially in small towns like Millvale. Bobby and Lorraine both grew up feeling like they didn't quite belong anywhere. They weren't fully white, weren't fully Japanese. They were something in between, something people didn't have a name for. It was confusing and isolating. Lorraine was protective of her mother from an early age. When she was 8, a girl at school said Fumiko was a Jap, and that Japs were bad. Lorraine told the girl to shut up. When the girl didn't, Lorraine pushed her down. The teacher scolded Lorraine, and Lorraine came home crying. Fumiko held her and said, "You don't have to fight for me, sweetheart. I can take care of myself." "But it's not fair," Lorraine sobbed. "You didn't do anything wrong." "I know," Fumiko said. "But people are afraid of what they don't understand. The best thing we can do is show them there's nothing to be afraid of." When Lorraine was 12, a boy at school, a kid named Derek whose grandfather had fought in the Pacific, called Fumiko a Jap and said his grandfather had killed people like her in the war, and he wished he'd killed more. Lorraine punched Derek in the mouth, splitting his lip. She got suspended for 3 days. Jim was furious, not at Lorraine, but at the world that made his daughter feel like she had to fight. "You can't hit people, Lorraine," Jim said, but his voice was gentle. "He said terrible things about Mom," Lorraine said, her eyes blazing. "I know," Jim said, "and he was wrong, but hitting him just makes it worse." Fumiko held Lorraine that night and said, "You're so brave, my darling, braver than I ever was. But you don't have to fight my battles. I've been fighting them my whole life, and I'm still here. What I need from you is to be strong, be kind, and be proud of who you are. Can you do that for me?" Lorraine nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I'll try." Bobby's experience was different. He was younger, more sensitive. The teasing hurt him deeply. Kids at school called him half-breed and Jap Jr. They made fun of the lunches Fumiko packed for him. Rice balls and pickled vegetables instead of sandwiches and chips. Bobby started throwing his lunches away and going hungry. He begged Fumiko to pack him normal food. Fumiko's heart broke, but she agreed. She started making him peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, packing him chips and cookies like the other kids had. Bobby also asked her not to come to school events because her accent embarrassed him. Fumiko agreed to that too, hiding her pain behind a calm smile. Jim saw what was happening and tried to talk to Bobby. "Your mother loves you more than anything in the world," Jim said. "She's given up everything for this family. Don't push her away." "I'm not pushing her away," Bobby said defensively. "I just want to fit in." "Fitting in isn't worth losing who you are," Jim said. But Bobby didn't understand. Not yet. The years passed. Jim worked long hours at the mill, his body slowly wearing down from the physical labor. Fumiko took a job at the local library, shelving books and helping patrons. She loved it. The head librarian, a woman named Eleanor, was kind and open-minded. She didn't care where Fumiko was from. She cared that Fumiko was smart, hard-working, and passionate about books. Eleanor became Fumiko's first real friend in America. Jim never gave up hope that his mother would come around. Every Christmas, he sent her a card with a photo of the family: Jim, Fumiko, Lorraine, and Bobby, smiling in front of their small house. Every year the card came back unopened, marked, "Return to sender." It hurt, but Jim kept sending them. He wanted his mother to know that he was happy, that he'd built a good life, that he didn't regret his choice. In 1978, Jim received a letter from a neighbor in Harlan, Kentucky. His mother had suffered a stroke. She was in a nursing home, partially paralyzed, unable to speak clearly. The neighbor thought Jim should know. Jim stared at the letter for a long time, his hands shaking. Then he booked a flight to Kentucky. He didn't tell Fumiko where he was going until the night before. "I need to see her," he said. "I need to try one more time." Fumiko touched his face gently. "I understand," she said. "Give her my love, even if she doesn't want it." The flight to Kentucky was Jim's first time on an airplane. He was 55 years old, and the world had changed so much since he'd left. The nursing home was on the outskirts of Harlan, a low gray building that smelled like disinfectant and boiled vegetables. Jim walked down the hallway, his heart pounding, until he found his mother's room. Margaret Mitchell was in a wheelchair by the window, staring out at nothing. She was 81 years old, a ghost of the strong, fierce woman who had raised him. Her hair was white, her face deeply lined. Her left side was paralyzed from the stroke, her hand curled uselessly in her lap. Jim sat down beside her. "Mom," he said softly. "It's me. It's Jim." She turned her head slowly. Her eyes were cloudy, but there was recognition there, and something else: regret, deep and overwhelming. "I'm sorry I disappointed you," Jim said, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry I didn't turn out the way you wanted, but I need you to know, I have a good life. I have a wife who loves me, 2 incredible kids. I'm happy, Mom. I wish you could have been part of it. I wish you could have known them." Margaret's mouth moved. It took her 3 tries to get the words out. "I was wrong." Jim's breath caught. "What?" Tears spilled down her weathered cheeks. "Wrong," she whispered again. "So, sorry." Jim took her hand, the good one, and held it tightly. "It's okay, Mom. It's okay." They sat together in silence as the afternoon light faded. Jim told her about Fumiko, about Lorraine and Bobby, about the life he'd built. Margaret listened, tears streaming down her face, unable to speak but nodding occasionally. 3 days later, Margaret Mitchell passed away peacefully in her sleep. Jim was with her. Her last words to him, whispered with great effort, were, "Tell her, I'm sorry." Jim came home and told Fumiko everything. She cried, not out of anger, but out of grief for the years they had all lost, for the relationship that could have been. "She was your mother," Fumiko said. "I wish I could have known her. I wish she could have known us." "She wished that too," Jim said. At the end, she wished that too. The 1980s and 90s brought change. Lorraine went to college, became a social worker, and dedicated her life to helping immigrant families navigate the challenges Fumiko had faced. She married a man named David, a kind, steady man who worked as a teacher. They had 2 children, a son named James, after Lorraine's father, and a daughter named Keiko, after Fumiko's lost brother. Lorraine made sure her children knew their grandmother's story, knew the sacrifices Fumiko had made, knew the courage it took to build a life in a hostile land. Bobby took longer to find his way. He drifted through his 20s, working odd jobs, moving from city to city, never quite settling. He was still struggling with his identity, still trying to figure out where he belonged. He dated, but never seriously. He kept his distance from the family, visiting only on holidays, always leaving early. In 2003, Fumiko was diagnosed with lung cancer. She had never smoked, but the doctors said it didn't matter. Sometimes cancer just happened. The prognosis wasn't good. She had maybe a year, possibly 2 if the treatment worked. Bobby came home when he heard the news. He was 41 years old, still adrift, still searching. He moved back into his childhood home to help care for Fumiko. Jim was 79, too old and frail to manage on his own. Lorraine visited as often as she could, but she had her own family to care for. One afternoon, while Fumiko was resting, Bobby went up to the attic looking for old blankets. He found a box he'd never seen before tucked away in a corner. Inside were letters, dozens of them. Letters Jim had written to Fumiko during their courtship in Japan. Letters Fumiko had written but never sent, pouring out her fears and hopes and dreams. Photographs of them in Tokyo, young and fragile and desperately in love. A pressed flower, a chocolate bar wrapper, small, precious pieces of a story Bobby had never fully understood. Bobby sat on the attic floor and read every single letter. He read about his father's love, fierce and unwavering. He read about his mother's fear, her courage, her determination to build a life against impossible odds. He read about the sacrifices they'd made, the hatred they'd endured, the loneliness and isolation, and he realized, with a clarity that took his breath away, that he'd been ashamed of the most extraordinary thing about himself, his mother's strength, his parents' love. He came downstairs with tears streaming down his face. Fumiko was awake, sitting in her favorite chair by the window. She looked small and frail, the cancer eating away at her. Bobby knelt beside her chair and took her hand. "Mom," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry. I'm sorry I was ashamed of you. I'm sorry I didn't understand. I'm sorry I wasted so much time." Fumiko smiled, her eyes soft. "You were a child. Children want to fit in. I never blamed you." "You should have," Bobby said. "No," Fumiko said firmly. "You're here now. That's what matters. You're here, and I get to see you, and that's enough." Bobby spent the next year at his mother's side. He learned to cook the Japanese dishes she loved. He listened to her stories, recording them so they wouldn't be lost. He asked her questions he should have asked years ago, about her childhood, about her parents, about what it was like to leave everything behind. Fumiko told him everything, grateful to finally share her story with her son. Fumiko Tanaka Mitchell passed away on a quiet morning in April 2008. She was 82 years old. Jim was holding her hand when she took her last breath. "I'll see you soon," he whispered. "Wait for me." The funeral was small but well attended. Lorraine and her family came, of course. Bobby was there, devastated. Eleanor from the library came, now elderly herself. Several families Lorraine had helped through her work came to pay their respects. They told stories about Fumiko, her kindness, her strength, her quiet dignity. Jim sat in the front row, holding Fumiko's favorite scarf, and listened to people talk about the woman he'd loved for over 60 years. Jim lived another 6 years without Fumiko. They were long, lonely years. He moved in with Lorraine and her family, unable to live alone. He spent his days sitting in a chair by the window, much like his mother had, staring out at nothing. But when his grandchildren and great-grandchildren visited, he came alive. He told them stories about Fumiko, about the woman who had crossed an ocean and endured hatred because she believed in love. He told them about New Year's Eve, 1945, when he stood beside a woman who had lost everything and promised her a future. James Mitchell passed away in his sleep in August 2014. He was 91 years old. Lorraine found him in the morning, peaceful and still. On his nightstand was a photograph of Fumiko, taken in Tokyo in 1946. She was smiling, young and beautiful, and full of hope. They buried Jim next to Fumiko in the Millvale Cemetery. The headstones were simple. James Mitchell, 1923 to 2014, beloved husband and father, and Fumiko Mitchell, 1926-2008, beloved wife and mother. Lorraine added a line to Fumiko's headstone. She crossed oceans. Today, in 2025, Lorraine is 67 and Bobby is 63. They still live in Pennsylvania, not far from the house where they grew up. They've spent years collecting their parents' story, letters, photographs, interviews with people who knew them. They've given talks at schools, community centers, libraries, anywhere people will listen. They talk about love, resilience, and the cost of prejudice. They talk about two people who chose each other when the world told them it was impossible. Bobby's son, named James after his grandfather, recently got married. His bride is Korean American, a woman named Grace. At the wedding, Bobby stood up to give a toast. His hands were shaking, but his voice was strong. "My parents taught me something I didn't understand until I was too old and they were gone," Bobby said. "They taught me that love isn't easy. It's not supposed to be. Real love requires courage. It requires sacrifice. It requires standing up to the world and saying, 'I don't care what you think. This person matters to me and I'm going to fight for them.' My father did that. He gave up his family, his home, everything he knew, because he loved my mother, and my mother did the same. She left her country, endured hatred and isolation because she loved my father, and together they built something beautiful. They built us, me and Lorraine and our families. The family you choose, the family you fight for, that's the family that matters. So James and Grace, as you start your life together, remember that. Love each other fiercely, stand up for each other, and don't let anyone tell you that your love isn't valid or isn't enough, because it is. It always is." The room erupted in applause. Lorraine, sitting at the head table, wiped tears from her eyes. She thought about her mother, about the quiet strength Fumiko had carried every single day of her life. She thought about her father, about the way he had loved Fumiko with a fierceness that never wavered, even when it cost him everything. After the wedding, Lorraine and Bobby visited their parents' graves. They brought flowers, white chrysanthemums, Fumiko's favorite. The cemetery was quiet, peaceful. They stood together in the spring sunshine looking at the headstones. "Do you think they knew?" Bobby asked. "Do you think they knew how much they mattered? How many lives they changed?" Lorraine smiled. "I think they knew they mattered to each other. And in the end, that's what kept them going. That's what made everything worth it." Bobby nodded. "I wish I'd understood sooner." "You understand now," Lorraine said. "That's what matters." They stood there a little longer, two children of an impossible love, grateful for the courage their parents had shown. Then they walked back to their cars, carrying the story forward, making sure it would never be forgotten. Because some love stories aren't just about two people. They're about changing the world, one brave choice at a time.